Okay, so starting off today's show, we will be doing the same thing we do every Monday here on the Zach Kroll Sports Podcast when we are talking college basketball, and that is that I'm going to be giving you guys my top 10 takeaways of the week from week 5 of college basketball, and I just wanted to say this. There are no Big Ten takeaways on this segment today because we are actually going to be doing our own segment on the Big Ten and everything that has been going on in that league a little bit later in the show. So if you're a Big Ten fan, don't get really worried that no Big Ten team appeared on this segment. Don't worry about it. The Big Ten conversation will be coming. So boys, without further ado, hit the music. Top 10 takeaways of week 4 of college basketball. Here we go. Takeaway number 1. Just when we thought Gonzaga was really, really good, they're even better than I expected. I'm not going to lie. Going into this game against Virginia, did I expect Gonzaga to win? Yeah, I think we all did. But I did think when you consider the fact that Virginia knows they only could win games with elite defense, I thought maybe if any defense would be able to slow down Gonzaga's offense, it would be Virginia's. Boy, was I wrong. Gonzaga ran Virginia out of the gym, and it was very easy to tell that super early in the game, Gonzaga was the better team, and that Virginia really wasn't necessarily going to give them any trouble going forward. I was so impressed with the Zags when they played that lineup of Suggs and Nebhart and Ayayi and Kispert and Timmy. There aren't many lineups in the sport of college basketball that are better than that. And you also combine that with the fact that they play in the WCC. And I totally understand that you can make the argument, as a college basketball conference, the WCC is much improved. However, here's the problem. As improved as that conference has been, I think you can make the argument that Gonzaga has improved as well. And without fans, it's going to be really hard for a team like BYU, a team like St. Mary's, a team like San Francisco to beat Gonzaga because the Zags are just so good. And they are right now the favorite to win the NCAA championship. They are such a good basketball team. I can't say enough about the job Mark Few and the rest of his staff has done. Takeaway number 2. I wanted to give a quick shout out to the UCF Knights. And I understand we watched them on Saturday against Houston, and they came up just short. But the Knights are one of the more surprising teams I've seen so far in college basketball. And on Tuesday night against Cincinnati, they were really impressive. And I got to be honest with you guys about this as well. We talk about teams that have been some of the most disappointing squads in college basketball so far this season. I would throw the Cincinnati Bearcats right on that list. Watching them, they're not a very good basketball team. But one thing I'll say about UCF is that this kid, Brandon Mahan, he could really play. He's averaging 20 points a game. And we know Johnny Dawkins and the success he's had prior to this season as the head coach of UCF. We all know that the team with Taco Fall just barely lost to Duke in the NCAA tournament. But they have some dudes on this team. A couple transfers from the Power 5 level, including the Louisville transfer Darius Perry. He's averaging 8 points a game. CJ Walker, former Oregon Duck. He is now playing closer to home in Florida. He's averaging about 5 points a game, but he's an elite rebounder, an elite shot blocker as well. Darren Green could really shoot it. Same with Tony Johnson Jr. I think UCF has been one of the more surprising teams so far this college basketball season, and they deserve some credit. But at the same time, Cincinnati's not very good. I understand they lost Jerron Cumberland, and he was a phenomenal player, one of the best players in the history of the Bearcats program. But come on now. Cincinnati needs to be a little bit more competitive. And I remember them losing a game early in the season to Xavier, and it really was evident from the beginning of the tip-off of that game that Xavier was just the better team. They took a loss to Tennessee, which is fine, but still, you would have wanted them to be a little bit more competitive. That game wasn't really close. They lose to UCF at home, to USF at home. They lose to UCF on the road, lose to Georgia on the road by 15. I don't think Cincinnati's a very good basketball team right now. John Brandon and the boys need to get their business taken care of. Takeaway number 3. Kansas at Allen Fieldhouse is still very hard to beat. And it was crazy because in the first half, West Virginia played a really good game. I was impressed with the way Sean McNeil was balling out. I've said it many times before on this show. when West Virginia is making jump shots, they are one of the toughest teams in college basketball to defeat. The problem is, I was wrong about Kansas, man. This team, and I say it every week, is so much better than I've expected, and it just shows you just how good of a coach Bill Self is. When Kansas is out here just making 3 after 3 after 3, and you see the development of guys like Jalen Wilson, a guy like Christian Braun, Marcus Garrett played well against West Virginia, McCormick played well, Bryce Thompson. There are a lot of really good players on this Kansas Jayhawk squad, and I think right now, if you ask me who is the biggest threat to Baylor at the top of the Big 12, I would say Kansas. I think there's even a realistic shot that Kansas can overtake Baylor in that Big 12, and it's nothing against Baylor. Every time I've watched them play basketball this season, they've impressed me, but Kansas has just done it against a little bit better competition. They really, didn't deserve to win the game against Texas Tech that much until the last 5 minutes when Bill Self just completely took over and coached circles around Chris Beard. He has been phenomenal against West Virginia at Phog Allen Fieldhouse. Since the Mountaineers have joined the Big Ten, he has never lost to West Virginia at home. And Bill Self, as good of a program as Kansas is, and as good of a coach as I know he is, I still believe that on a national level, he is underrated. And the job that he's been able to do with the 2020-2021 Kansas Jayhawks has been one of his most impressive coaching efforts since he's taken over in Lawrence. Takeaway number 4. I'm telling you guys right now, don't bail on San Diego State. I understand they lost to BYU, and it was a tough loss, but I'll say this as well. I think BYU is a really good basketball team, and the fact that San Diego State lost to them at home last week, was it a bad loss? Yeah, ideally I think that's a game you want to win. But at the same time, I was so impressed with the way San Diego State was able to respond on Tuesday night against St. Mary's. That was another game where I turned it on, and 5 minutes in, I was just like, all right, this is a wrap. I know San Diego State is winning. Brian Dutcher has done a phenomenal job since he's gotten to San Diego State as the head coach. You really see the development of guys like Matt Mitchell and Jordan Shackle and Nathan Mensah, and it's crazy because even though those 3 guys are out here playing at San Diego State, I believe if you put any of those guys on a Duke or a Kentucky or some of the other powerhouse teams in college basketball that just this season have been struggling, I think that would be the case as well. Not many teams in college basketball, and I'm being dead honest when I say this, have a top 3 as San Diego State does with Shackle, Mitchell, and Mensah. When those 3 guys are on the court, San Diego State is very hard to beat. And Matt Mitchell against BYU, I don't know how many of you guys saw that. He almost had 40 points. He was ridiculous. And I think he's good enough to be a best player on a really good team. I'll throw another take at you guys. San Diego State was supposed to get Malachi Flynn back. Flynn was a former transfer from Washington State. He's now in the NBA with the Toronto Raptors, and he got drafted, so I'm not going to blame him for leaving. But I think if he would have came back to San Diego State, the Aztecs would be on the same level as Gonzaga right now. I don't know if you guys consider that to be a hot take or what, but this is a really good basketball team that deserves to be noticed. Takeaway number 5. I was really impressed by Creighton and the way they were able to come back against Xavier. I've spoken a lot about the Blue Jays on this show over the last couple weeks, and it's just because they were a team that going into the season I expected a lot out of, and they've had a really roller coaster season. Even though they lost that game at Phog Allen Fieldhouse to Kansas when Zagorowski missed the free throw, that was still an impressive effort. The fact that they were even competitive in that game really impressed me when you consider the fact that Jalen Wilson was just hitting shots at an unconscious rate. But then, I think we could all agree, we've had our concerns about Creighton. They lost to Marquette at home. Historically, that's usually not a game that they lose. And then in this game against Xavier, I think their fans in the beginning were a little concerned. Xavier's a really good team. They've played some really good basketball to start off their season. And for the first 25 minutes of this game against Creighton, you kind of felt that they could really be the team that establishes the throne as the top challenger in the Big East to Villanova, but I was super impressed with the way Creighton was able to come back and get the job done. we all know that so far this season, my guy, Marcus Zagorowski, hasn't necessarily been the player we all expected him to be in the preseason for this Blue Jays team. He's a guy that I predicted would win Big East Player of the Year, but I was impressed with the way a guy like Anton Jones was able to come in and really change the feel of the game for Creighton against Xavier. We all know some of the other veteran guys they have on that team, Mahoney and Ballack and Jefferson, Christian David. They also have a young big man in Kalkbrunner that's been playing well. Creighton is a team I'm going to be monitoring going forward. I still think right now, if you ask me, who is the biggest threat to Villanova in the Big East, I'd say them. But they're a very up-and-down team, and if they could keep the momentum going like they did against Xavier, they will definitely be a team that I will have on my radar. Takeaway number 6. This was from Monday, but man, Penny Hardaway cannot be out here losing to Tulsa. And Memphis is in trouble, man. I'll be honest with you. If you ask me, Zach, when you ask yourself, who is the most disappointing team in college basketball so far this season, who would you say? And I think the obvious answer for most people, including myself, would be Kentucky. This is a Wildcat team that predicted to win the national championship before the season started. It obviously hasn't worked out like that, I get it. But I think if there is another team that you're going to throw in the conversation, and we spoke about Cincinnati being very disappointing in terms of the American so far, I think Memphis is another one. You can't be out here losing to Tulsa. You can't be out here losing to Auburn. When you have a roster like this that just has so much talent, Boogie Ellis, Wester Quinones, DJ Jeffries, Landers Nolly, Musa Cisse, Alex Lomax, could you imagine what an actual good coach would do with the talent that Memphis has? And watching them against Tulsa at home the other night was super frustrating. They just could not do anything on offense. And I don't know what they were doing. And Penny Hardaway and this team is in trouble. You saw that, ironically, before this game against Tulsa, Memphis and their athletic program announced that Penny Hardaway was signed to an extension. And I understand he's an elite recruiter. He's gotten a bunch of talent at Memphis, and he's made the Tiger program relevant again. And historically, over the last 5 to 7 years when Josh Pastner was the head coach, I get it, they weren't relevant, but it's not like he's winning games. I still think Penny Hardaway, as a head coach, has a lot he needs to show and a lot to prove until I put him as a guy that could win games with, less talent and, could really overcome that talent deficiency. If he can't win with this team, I'm not necessarily sure he could win with many other teams at Memphis. Takeaway number 7. I may have overhyped Richmond a bit. I understand the Kentucky win at the time looked significantly better than it actually was, but Richmond goes out here and loses to Hofstra at home. I understand Hofstra's really good, but that's not a team you could lose to when you're trying to get an at-large bid into the NCAA tournament. And I think if that's the only bad loss they take this season, they'll be fine if a team like St. Louis or a team like Dayton actually ends up winning the Atlantic 10. But I'll be honest, I expected a little bit more from this Richmond team. We all know the dudes they have, Grant Golden and Blake Francis and Brandon Sherrod, Gilliard, Kaio. They got some good guys on this Richmond team, but I think in order for them to secure an at-large NCAA tournament bid, if they don't necessarily want to win the Atlantic 10, it may be a little difficult now. You look at the rest of their non-conference schedule, it hasn't been awful. They had the win against Vanderbilt, even though that's against an SEC team. I'm not necessarily sure how much stock you're going to be given for that. They also, when you look at the rest of their schedule, they obviously beat Kentucky at Rupp. They also had a nice win against Northern Iowa, but at the time, which looked like a nice win, but Northern Iowa is really struggling right now. They also barely beat Loyola Chicago after almost blowing a big lead. Also lose to Hofstra. Their next 3 games are at Davidson, home St. Bonaventure, home Rhode Island. I think at the minimum, Richmond needs to go 2-1 in that stretch, maybe even 3-0, or else they could be in trouble. Richmond is another team that when you look at everyone in college basketball, I am definitely going to be keeping my eye on them because let's face it, St. Louis is really good. And they, right now, to me, look like the best team in the Atlantic 10. St. Bonaventure is good. Rhode Island is good. Dayton is good. VCU is good. Even UMass is a team that could cause some havoc. But I just don't trust Richmond right now, especially after the way they played against Hofstra. Takeaway number 8. We're going to get to Kentucky in a little bit and just exactly how bad this game was from their perspective. But I'll say this about Louisville. They deserve some credit because they were able to get a home win where they didn't necessarily look like the better team on the floor than Kentucky. And I feel like when you look at the Cardinals, their resume is a little bit better right now than what you see with your eyes on the basketball floor. But Louisville still deserves credit. They have two players out right now that, to be honest, I thought when those two guys got hurt would have a much bigger impact on the team. Those two players are two guys by the name of Malik Williams and Charles Minlend. Williams is a guy that has been around this Louisville program since Chris Mack has gotten here. He's a good veteran presence and a guy that I thought going into the season is going to be very important for this Louisville team to have. They also lose Charles Minlend, the transfer from San Francisco. He's a guy that could play at the ACC level, a really good stretch four. But it's guys like David Johnson and Carlik Jones in that Louisville backcourt that are really doing whatever they can to get the job done. If I'm a Louisville fan, I would want to see a little more of Samuel Williamson. You see flashes, but he hasn't necessarily been that consistent yet so far this season. I would want to see him take a little bit more of a bigger jump once Louisville starts getting a little bit healthier and once the guys start coming back in. But I like some of these young players as well. Dre Davis could really play. I like the kid Withers. Trainer's a big body. And Chris Mack, we all know how good he is at developing talent, especially when they stay in the program for multiple years. And I think eventually that's going to be the case with this Louisville team. But until Williams and Minlend come back, if the Cardinals can just rely on that big three of Johnson, Jones, and Williamson, I think in a conference that is wide open like the ACC, they could be in a good spot going forward. Takeaway number 9. What is going to happen with Patrick Ewing at Georgetown? I know that's a question rather than a takeaway, but the takeaway from Georgetown after this week is this. I'm not sure what direction they're going in. And it's always interesting because I think it's something we're seeing right now at the college football level with the University of Michigan. It's that it's very hard when you bring in a guy to coach your team who is an absolute legend of the school because you obviously don't want to offend him. You don't want to, go move on bad terms. But when I watch Patrick Ewing, the problem with this Georgetown program isn't necessarily that they're not winning. It's just they're not even getting better. And I understand that going into the season, most people's expectations for Georgetown, including mine, were very, very low. They were very, very minimal. I don't think anyone really expected them to make the NCAA tournament. It's just a tough look for Patrick Ewing when last year, supposed to be the year where you break through for Georgetown. You have some talent in that program that you've developed yourself. Akinjo, McClung, LeBlanc, Blair, Pickett, Wahab, guys like that. And when your best two players last year decide to leave the program before the season even starts, before the conference season even starts for Georgetown, like Akinjo and then McClung leaves and LeBlanc, those three guys all leave, it's tough to really justify how this Georgetown program is going to get better with Patrick Ewing at the helm. I think they could be in for a rough season. They've already lost to Providence during they beat Providence during that was Butler. They lost to Providence during non-conference play. They also lose to Seton Hall a couple weeks ago when Mamu wasn't even playing his best game. And Georgetown's in trouble right now. When you look at the rest of their team, Jalen Harris, I just don't necessarily know if guys like that are going to be able to get the job done for a coach like Patrick Ewing at the Big East level. And takeaway number 10. I'd like to give a quick shout out to Kevin Keatts, Devin Daniels, and the NC State Wolfpack because I'll admit, this was a big season for Kevin Keatts and the Pack. I like the hire NC State made bringing him in. We all know the success he was able to have at UNC Wilmington, and he had a really good first year. But the last 2 years, when you consider the talent on this NC State team, I believe their fans had a right to be a little bit skeptical about Kevin Keatts and the direction of this team going into the season. They also lose Josh Hall to the NBA early, top player in high school like Jalen Lake. So those were two tough breaks that NC State ultimately got the wrong end of. But I'll say this. The team on Tuesday night against UNC played much better than anyone could have ever expected. They were missing DJ Funderburk, who's their top big man, but they were able to rely on guys like Devin Daniels and guys like Manny Bates and guys like Cam Hayes. They were able to rely on those guys to get the job done. I was also really impressed with Shaquille Moore, the transfer, and the effort that he was able to give off the bench. And I'll say this, I mentioned it briefly when I was talking about Louisville. I think when you look at all the Power 6 conferences in the college basketball right now, the ACC could be the one that's the most wide open. We saw Virginia play against Gonzaga. They weren't very good. We saw UNC playing this game against NC State. They cannot take care of the basketball to save their lives. Duke hasn't really shown us anything since they got blown out by Michigan State and Illinois to make us think that they could be the team to beat. Florida State loses to UCF at home. Miami's been very up and down. Syracuse, when you watch them, I don't think they look like a team that could run away with the ACC. And NC State, they did go on the road to St. Louis. They lost the game, but they were competitive considering the fact that they were missing a bunch of players. They only had 9 guys, and they played really well against North Carolina the other night. I was impressed. Shout out to Kevin Keatts and the Wolfpack.